This is Gareth Southgate, and this is the Three Lions podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Three Lions podcast. My name is Russell Osborne and this is an independent England football supporters podcast. Thank you as always for joining me. You have joined me once again as we're learning about another Three Lions chief in our England Managers series. These come around every so often as I like to try and speak with people who have written about their subject. And in order for me to do that as properly as I'd like to, I try and read the book. And as I've mentioned before, I'm not the fastest reader in town, but I'm persistent, if nothing else. Already in this series, we've taken a look at Walter Winterbottom, Alf Ramsey, Don Revie, Ron Greenwood, Bobby Robson, and we also took a little sidestep when we looked at Don Howe. All of those episodes are available at your podcast provider of choice or threelionspodcast.com. Right, let's get on with it.
Now, next up in our England Manager series is Graham Taylor, England manager between 1990 and 1993. He was England's sixth full-time manager. And here to talk more about him is Lionel Birnie, ghostwriter of his autobiography, Graham Taylor, in his own words. Lionel, hello there.
Hello there. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining me. Are you well?
I'm very well, thank you. Yes. When you say that, Graham Taylor's only the sixth man to manage England, and I think that was a real source of pride for him. Only 5 full-time official England managers had gone before him, and I think, at that time, 1990, the significance of that couldn't be underestimated, really.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, managers in whatever job, I guess, in Premier League or Championship or across the world, they don't seem to last so long. But from Walter Winterbottom's first placement back in, what would it have been, the mid-50s, I think it was, to 1990, to only be the sixth one is, quite an achievement for both the FA and the people that they put in place.
Indeed, yeah. And, as we'll no doubt discuss, I mean, it didn't go entirely to plan for Graham Taylor, did it? It was a difficult time to take over as manager, I think. England coming off the back of a semi-final in Italia 90 and the high of all of that, and kind of when you think back to just how important that summer was in the context of English football history, I mean, really, the Premier League was born out of that summer, wasn't it? Gazza's tears and the whole country kind of falling back in love with football again. And so I think people expected the England team to go from strength to strength. But of course, I think there were some pretty good reasons why that didn't happen. And not all of them are totally the responsibility of the manager, I don't think. But I suppose I ought to, make my kind of friendly bias, acknowledge it right at the outset, because I am a Watford supporter. Graham Taylor was a sort of childhood hero of mine because he managed the great Watford team that I first went to watch with my dad. And so I feel kind of almost protective towards Graham Taylor's legacy, not to the point where I'll defend the sort of indefensible, but I do think that, he was a very decent man, a very dignified man who really was dealt quite a difficult job. And I don't think he realised when he accepted the job just how difficult it was going to turn out to be.
Yeah, nicely put. Well, I think, you've mentioned Watford there, and we need to speak about Watford to get to his part in the whole England cycle. But I think first, just so we all know sort of where we stand, you ghost wrote this book. What is a ghostwriter? How did that come about?
Well, a ghostwriter is somebody who effectively puts into words the thoughts and the stories and the essence of the subject. So basically, writing the book for Graham. A ghostwriter is a sort of surrogate storyteller, I guess, rather than the actual subject sitting down and hitting the keys. The ghostwriter, certainly in my case, I spent a lot of time with Graham over more than a 2-year period, interviewing him both formally and informally about his life and his career, and just getting a sense of the story that he wanted to tell, so that when it came out, it was the book that he wanted to show the world. Of course, Graham died before the book was actually published. We'd finished the great majority, the real bulk of all of the interviewing process, and I was well through writing the first draft when he passed away in January 2017. So the book was then completed without him, but with the blessing of his widow Rita and family, and his longtime agent and friend, a man called Ian Wilson, who had been instrumental in helping me get the book to the point that we got it to. And then obviously it became a really different job once Graham had passed away, because not that there was any less responsibility to accurately convey what Graham wanted when he was alive, but without him here to kind of bounce off and double check and just make sure that it was going in the direction he wanted, I had to rely on a few other people just to make sure that the book was the reflection of his life and career that he had envisaged when we set out on the journey. And so it was a real challenge as a journalist, because as a journalist you want to tell the best stories you possibly can, in the most dynamic way you possibly can. But I was very aware once he passed away that this book was the story of his life, and that he wasn't going to be here, unfortunately, to kind of breathe life to those stories once the book was published in the normal way. Because had he been alive, there would have been a whole round of TV and radio interviews, and he probably would have done podcasts like this in my place. The ghostwriter is supposed to be behind the curtain, in the shadows, anonymous. It's not my voice. And I suppose the biggest challenge was just trying to make sure that the story was Graham Taylor in his own words. And hopefully people felt that was what I managed to achieve. Certainly his widow Rita and Ian Wilson were happy with the end result. But the fact that Graham wasn't here to see it actually as a physical book that was really a tough period.
Yeah, I can well imagine. You mentioned there that you obviously the aim is to make sure it's not your voice. And as soon as I opened the book and started reading it, I met Graham once in Ukraine, actually, of all places, on an England journey, and I could really feel his voice telling the story right from those opening few pages. So I think the book, in his own words, it really does come across as in his own words.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, he had a very distinct way of expressing himself, didn't he?
Yeah.
Almost to the point of caricature. I mean, obviously we may get onto the documentary and those phrases that became catchphrases that almost haunted him, really, or they certainly followed him around, didn't they? Can we not knock it? And hit Les, and I mean, he, even when talking sort of informally, he had little phrases. I almost thought it was like a sort of, like a lead guitarist. You kind of sort of hear these little familiar refrains in some of the phrases that he would use. And I suppose the biggest thing for me was to make sure that his voice didn't stray over the line into caricature, and that it stayed a kind of authentic, serious Graham Taylor voice without becoming almost a sort of spitting image puppet version of his voice. And I suppose as we went on, and also once he passed away, and he wasn't there to kind of call and just, go through a couple of points and just bring that voice back to the forefront of my mind, it became harder to kind of just, I guess, keep that voice alive. But yeah, it was an incredible project to have worked on, especially the way it turned out. And whilst I had some misgivings at the time, are we doing the right thing, pushing on with this? I'm really, really glad that we did, and that we got it out, and that the hardback edition exists, and that it's there to tell the story of his life and career.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's get on to his life, his career, and take it up to that England time. He was born the 15th of September 1944, grew up in the Scunthorpe area, and what I found was quite interesting, that his father was a journalist, so he really had, right at the very beginning, an insight into that journalist side of things that he would famously encounter later on in his life.
Yeah, that's right. His dad was a sports writer for the local paper in Scunthorpe, and he covered the local football team, Scunthorpe United, of course, and other sports, in the old tradition of a local newspaperman, when, that was a really decent job. It was in an era where not everyone aspired to, perhaps go off to Fleet Street. You could make a good living as a local newspaperman, and his father was well respected. And so Graham was sort of in and around newspapers from a young age. He knew the inside of the press box at Scunthorpe's ground, and he used to go down to the office where the paper, they had a press in the office at the Evening Telegraph, I think it was, the newspaper. And so he very, very early on, he would perhaps sit with his dad in the press box, or watch the Scunthorpe game from the terraces, and then meet up with his dad, and then they'd go down to the office in time for that Saturday evening paper to come rolling off the presses, and he'd see the words that his dad had written in print in time for Saturday tea time. Which, I mean, again, we're talking about an era here, aren't we? I mean, now that sounds almost quaint, doesn't it? But back then that must have been really quite magical. But just not to skip forward, but I do think that Graham did understand journalism, and he understood journalists, and I think he tried to use that as a strength in his time as England manager. And I think perhaps it wasn't the strength that he thought it was, because he couldn't get everybody on side all at once going in the same direction, because the national newspaper journalists, not just the rivalries between the daily papers, but the rivalries sometimes between a Sunday paper and the daily sort of cousin, would be so intense that everybody wanted their piece of the England manager. And if they felt that he was, telling somebody something and somebody else something different, or, Graham tried to get them all together and get them all on side, not realising that, Fleet Street at that time was big, it was powerful, there were rivalries within the ranks of the journalists, and perhaps he tried a little bit too hard to be on their side and give them what he thought they wanted. But we can come on to that. But I do think it's interesting that Graham's world, his entire football career was definitely informed by an ability to communicate with journalists, and understanding that by communicating with journalists, you were communicating to the wider public. In the case of a club manager, that's your own team's supporters, and you can, in a way, use the media to convey what you want to get across, and explain situations, and keep supporters supporting the team.
Yeah, which he very much done when he became manager at Watford, is the way I understood it. But before he got there, as a player, whilst he grew up in Scunthorpe, he signed for Grimsby. I don't know if they're actually technically classed as rivals, Scunthorpe and Grimsby, but there's certainly not a huge difference between them. He became captain of Grimsby there, and eventually transferred to Lincoln City. It's not the football career of maybe an England manager you would immediately think would have. The likes of, say, Bobby Robson before him was maybe a little more prolific, had actually played for England. And when you look at England managers now, they've got the England history behind them. But no, Graham was playing for the likes of Grimsby and Lincoln.
Yeah, I think that was always held against him a bit when he was England manager, wasn't it? The fact that he hadn't played at the top level. I mean, when you look at football now, I mean, you can name a lot of managers who have not been excellent players. I mean, Arsene Wenger Jose Mourinho, just to name a couple who've had an incredible impact on English football. But, Graham was a decent footballer. I mean, he always kind of resented being described as a fullback because he had started his kind of, junior football career as an inside forward. He was the prolific goal scorer. He was the kid who, scored all the goals in the school team, in the district team, and then the next level up, and he went through every, promotion through sort of junior football being the star player. And it wasn't until, he got to Grimsby and didn't make perhaps the impact that he'd hoped. And he got kind of shoved into a fullback position in an FA Youth Cup tie for Grimsby. And the manager at the time decided, well, that's your position. And it kind of stuck. And he wanted to make a career in the game. And he had an eye on management even as a very young player. I mean, he qualified as an FA coach when he was still 21. And he did that because a few people around him, I think maybe recognised something about his personality, about his kind of diligence, I guess, and about the way he thought about the game, talked to people about the game. He clearly wanted to make a career in it, and he knew that as a player, especially a player in the 60s, a bad tackle could end a playing career, very easily. And then what? Then it's off to work, isn't it? And he had kind of made this decision to go into football as a grammar school boy. I don't think the school that he had gone to in Scunthorpe, I don't think they were terribly chuffed that he turned his back on, what should have been perhaps a sort of go down a more academic route. So he was sort of going out on a limb a little bit into the world of football, and he wanted to make it work, and he wanted to make it work for a lifetime, not just as a player. And I think that says a lot about him anyway. And basically, exactly what he thought might happen did happen, because he did sustain an injury. It wasn't a bad challenge. It was a sort of just a landing. And I think he's, various times he said he hurt his hip or he hurt his knee, and he always had problems down one side, and he just never quite got right. And, the medical support and the physiotherapy support back then was not the same as it is now. And so, he was always playing with a bit of a problem. And, he got his chance in management at Lincoln City when he was just 28, which, is, even then that was, then certainly it was unusual. Managers were senior people then, weren't they? It wasn't unusual for managers to go on into their, mid to late 60s at that time. So being a 28-year-old and being younger than some of his players, I think that was quite a baptism of fire for him at Lincoln.
Yeah, that's right. He replaced the manager David Hurd, who was manager of Lincoln at the time. Now, he, by all accounts, was commuting from Manchester, and I got the impression that Graham wasn't overly keen on the commuting from Manchester, and also his sort of ideology, and he thought that this David Hurd, his heart wasn't in it. So he was quite happy to take this role on, and to the point where he would always want his players to remain local. He didn't want players travelling that sort of distance to their club on a daily basis. But in doing so, as you say, he became the youngest manager in the Football League, but it wasn't easy for him. No wins in 11 to start with.
No, that's right. Just on that, David Hurd was a really top level footballer. I think he played 150 odd games for Arsenal. He played a couple of hundred games for Manchester United. He'd been teammates with Best, Law and Charlton. And I think the thing that Graham recognised as a lower division player with a squad of lower division players was that David Hurd was clearly better than some of the players that he was working with. And there's one little story that Graham said about sort of training. It didn't feel like Hurd was imparting any real kind of knowledge. He wasn't teaching lower division players how to get better. He would just say, well, when we get a throw in, Paddy Crerand would throw it to, Bobby Charlton, and Bobby Charlton would knock it on to Dennis Law, and then we'd go in behind. It's like, well, we haven't got anyone here who is, even Paddy Crerand, let alone Bobby Charlton and Dennis Law. And I think Graham recognised that management was about getting the very best out of whatever you've got available, and then identifying improvements to the squad when you recognise that certain players could be improved no more. But like you say, no wins in 11. But he was very lucky that the chairman and the real kind of driving force of Lincoln City at that time, a man called Henage Dove, was building a community club, wanted somebody to make the team successful. And he recognised something in Graham and gave him a lot of space to really create a football club and a football team. And all of the community work and the kind of the getting the supporters on side that he later did to great effect at Watford, he'd already done at Lincoln City. And he was really keen, as I was a Watford supporter when we were working together, he didn't want the impression to be that he only did this stuff when he was at Watford with Elton John's money. He'd done the kind of the thing of trying to build a club, build a team, get people through the turnstiles and create a sense of excitement with attacking football, because, Lincoln, I think they probably still do hold the record points tally for a Football League season. I mean, it might now be beaten by, Manchester City, but in the old days of 2 points for a win, if you translate it, I mean, they were an extremely good fourth division football side, and they scored a heck of a lot of goals. And really, that Lincoln side towards the end of the 70s was the kind of the blueprint of what Graham Taylor thought football was about, and that was attacking, trying to win, trying to excite people who came to watch the team.
He eventually sort of turned it round for Lincoln. He got them promoted, and in turn got himself noticed, because it was then that the sort of a first England connection sort of arose. As manager of Lincoln, he was called by the then manager Don Revie, who I think he'd got a message to call him, and he was a little bit, whoa, hello, what's all this about? And it certainly wasn't what came out of the conversation, which was the offer of sort of the Watford job.
Well, not quite the offer, was it? But no, I mean, Don Revie, managerial, superstar, wasn't he? That Leeds United team was okay, not popular with everybody, but no one could dispute that was an extremely good team. And Don Revie was an excellent manager. Obviously, his time at England was fairly controversial, wasn't it? But at that time, as the England manager, for Graham Taylor to get a call at home and a message saying, Don Revie's called for you, you're thinking, well, what on earth can this be? And then Revie said, are you under contract at Lincoln? And Graham had signed a contract at Lincoln, so he's like, well, yes, I am, but there is a clause. He said, well, investigate that clause, because there's a club that's interested in you. Oh yeah, who's that? And Graham, thinking, well, all right, it might not be Arsenal or Tottenham, but it might be somebody, in the first division. Don Revie said, well, I've had Elton John at Watford on the phone. And Graham was quite open. He knew the name Elton John, but he didn't really know. He wasn't a fan of Elton's music. He was just, Watford, they're in the fourth division. I'm at Lincoln, who are in the third division. Why on earth would I want to drop back down there and, start again? And so he felt almost like, he puffed himself up for this call with the England manager. And then he'd been sort of felt pretty deflated that, Don Revie hadn't, thought of, it wasn't ringing with a kind of much better news, or, that he'd recommended him perhaps for a big job. But as it turned out, Graham went to meet Elton John, and Elton was wealthy, a passionate Watford supporter. He'd supported the club since he was a boy. He had joined the board a few years earlier, and by this stage, he had taken over as chairman and was, basically in charge of the club. But he was in charge in a slightly directionless way. And a couple of the directors at Watford had, they had put Graham Taylor's name in the frame for the job. But Elton had been sort of swayed, perhaps by the star quality of Bobby Moore, and had actually interviewed Bobby Moore, and I believe had offered Bobby Moore the job, or said, look, the job's yours if you want it. And, ex-England captain, World Cup winner, Bobby Moore, that would have been a heck of a coup for Watford, but a couple of the Watford directors were not all that sure because they thought, look, we are in the 4th division. We need somebody who knows this division. They'd been very impressed with the Lincoln team. They'd met Graham in, for a cup of tea after Lincoln had taken Watford apart a season or two previously. And they really hammered away at Elton and said, look, you've got to at least consider Graham Taylor. So when Elton spoke to Don Revie and said, what about Graham Taylor? Don Revie said, yeah, good, promising young manager, has done a good job at Lincoln. Why not have a chat with him? So all of these kind of stars sort of aligned. And when Elton and Graham met at Elton's house in Windsor, Graham was just like, well, rock star chairman, £1 million worth of art probably hanging on the walls and sitting in the corridors. This is quite an eccentric, flamboyant character. What does he really know about football? And he said, well, what do you want to achieve? And Elton said, well, I want to get to the 1st division. I want to play in Europe and I want to play in an FA Cup final. And Graham was like, well, that's madness. That's madness. And he said, well, okay, let's think about this. How much do you think this is going to cost? And Elton said, well, you tell me, what do you think it's going to cost? And Graham thought, well, I'll really shock him here. And said, I don't think you'll get much change out of £1 million. And Elton said, great, let's give it a go then. And that was the start of a 10-year journey. And Watford reached 1st division. They were runners-up to Liverpool in 1983. They played in the UEFA Cup, which is the olden days version of the Europa League. And they reached an FA Cup final, which sadly they didn't win. They lost 2-0 to Everton in 1984. But I mean, the Elton and Graham story was remarkable. The rise through the leagues, I suppose Wimbledon kind of outdid them in a sense because Wimbledon did win the FA Cup final that they got to. But I mean, for me, certainly the Elton and Graham journey was kind of the romantic story of the 1980s in English football.
Yeah, I mean, you say he bought this. He had this community spirit at Lincoln, which then he wanted to bring to Watford, and he went round sort of schools and took the players along to schools. He encouraged the supporters club. He gave it that community feel. He was one of the first. Watford were one of the first clubs to have an electronic scoreboard. He had a hand in lots of little things in and around Watford and Vicarage Road, and I think there was another story there where I haven't made a note of this one, but I've just come to mind where there was there someone else using Vicarage Road?
Yeah, well, the local Greyhound Association had a contract to run greyhound racing round the sort of cinder track that went round the pitch, and at that time, the Greyhound people had the stadium on, I don't know, Wednesday afternoons and Friday nights and Monday nights or whatever it was. And it meant that they couldn't train on the pitch there. It meant that the Vicarage Road Stadium wasn't really Watford's. And I know this is probably a slightly exaggerated story, but it's one that Graham loved to tell, and it is a funny one. But one day they were at the stadium and he tried to get into the physio's room and the door was wedged shut, and he barged in. And the first team physio was basically had a greyhound up on the treatment table and sort of checking out its back legs, and Graham was like, what's going on here? And the physio said, I think he's just tweaked something, gaffer. Okay, probably a slightly invented story, but it paints a picture of a football club that wasn't all that serious. And Graham went to Elton and said, this is very early on, we're talking a matter of weeks. He said, look, this is ridiculous. Either the dogs go or I go. And, Graham, he'd taken the job on the basis that he was going to manage the football club, not just the football team. And, yeah, he took an interest in everything. The training facilities were improved, the youth setup was developed, the scouting network was completely overhauled and improved, but he had a say in everything, what colour the woodwork was in the offices and stuff. He ran the club from top to bottom at a time when being a football manager could encompass all of those things. And yeah, he did everything. He recognised that in order to be successful, they had to attract supporters. And being a fourth division club in a sort of suburban town without any real footballing pedigree, like Watford, just a kind of sleepy Hertfordshire town it was at the time, needed to get fans through the door, and he knew that there was a huge potential in attracting families and children. And the club did have a family sort of spirit and a family identity. Graham Taylor ran the London Marathon in 1983 to raise money to build a sort of terrace that was specifically for children and families to stand on, so that they would have a kind of a safe, welcoming, friendly environment without bad language to watch the games. And all of that work, I think, laid the groundwork for a club that now is, established as a sort of top 30 club in England, where really by right it's a kind of a lower division club. When you look at the sort of, when they first got in the Football League in 1920 or whenever it was, through to the 60s, they were really a third or fourth division club.
Yeah. Well, as you mentioned, he went on to achieve all those goals and targets that Elton John set him, and they worked together to do that, and they finished second. And just as he had done at Lincoln, he was turning heads of other people to look at him. It was then that the then England manager, Bobby Robson, he brought Graham into the England fold as the under-18 youth team manager. So he's sort of getting his England experience quite early then.
Yeah, I mean, he was always sort of kind of a Football Association establishment figure, because he was, he wasn't a controversial man, Graham. He was a disciplinarian. He spoke very well. He had standards. He fitted in. His face fitted in with the FA at that time. And yes, he was manager of the under-18 team for a European Championships. I mean, back in those days, I think it may even have been an annual tournament, but I mean, he was in charge of that squad for a tournament that was played at home, and I think some of the matches actually were played at Vicarage Road. Right. But yeah, his face always fitted in with the FA. He would have thought, even from that period of time, we're talking 83, I think that was, that he was on the right trajectory to have a shot at the England manager position if he knew he wasn't going to be appointed England manager from Watford. He knew that you had to be at a bigger club in order to prove that the managerial credentials and to really be taken seriously as a contender when the job eventually came up. But yeah, I think he was he was certainly someone that was trusted by the FA and by the kind of the England hierarchy, just because of the type of person he was, as much as his managerial skills.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned a bigger club, and with the greatest of respect to Watford, after what he had achieved there, he felt it was time to move on. And Aston Villa was his destination, who at the time were a second division side. He'd got the call or however to go and have a look around there and meet Deadly Doug Ellis, chairman back then. But despite sort of Aston Villa having that sort of status as they'd been European champions, I think, previously, he wasn't overly impressed straight away.
No, I mean, he built Watford up. In the season that he left Watford, so 1986-87, Watford finished ninth in the first division, which was their second highest position after that runners-up position in 1983. They've been solidly mid-table every season that they've been in the top flight, other than the year they were second. They were a good cup team. That season, 86-87, they got to the semi-final of the FA Cup, played at Villa Park, coincidentally, against Tottenham Hotspur. Didn't have much luck in the semi-final because both goalkeepers, the first team goalkeeper Tony Coton and the reserve Steve Sherwood, were both injured. Well, it's an infamous story for Watford supporters because of the transfer deadline having passed and because of the FA Cup rules, you couldn't pick anyone on loan who had played in the competition. They really had no goalkeeper, and the choice was between a 16-year-old David James, who was on the club's books and was the youth team goalkeeper at the time, and in the end, it came down to Gary Plumley, who was a goalkeeper who had played for Cardiff City, played for Newport County He'd actually played in the Cup Winners' Cup for Newport County, but he was also Watford's chief executive's son. And Graham always said there was no way he was going to expose a 16-year-old, and only just a 16-year-old at that, I think, David James, a very young kid. He was never going to expose a kid like that to an FA Cup semi-final, in front of 45,000 people and what have you. So they really were hamstrung, and they went for Gary Plumley, and he sort of came out of retirement. He was running a wine bar / restaurant down in South Wales at the time, and so it was kind of a bit of a joke story, a tabloid story, that the wine bar waiter was coming out of retirement to play in goal in an FA Cup semi-final. It didn't go very well. Watford lost 4-1, and Graham sort of bore the brunt of the kind of the fans' backlash and disappointment at that. And I think he recognised that Elton John's kind of enthusiasm and drive had waned. Again, without getting into the ins and outs of Elton John's life, the mid-'80s were a difficult time for him. His marriage had broken up. He was tabloid fodder, Elton John. He took an absolute kicking from the Sun. The coverage was appalling. When you look back, even by the standards of the day, it was appalling. But you look back now, it was really, really vicious, unpleasant coverage of Elton John's private life. We all know Elton's, he's on the record talking about his troubles with drugs and alcohol. And I think the football club was becoming an expensive, unwelcome diversion, whereas previously it had been the kind of saviour of Elton John. Again, he's talked about that, how having the club to focus on really kept him on the straight and narrow for a period of time. And his friendship with Graham kept him on the straight and narrow. But it came to sort of April, May 87, through the sort of back channel communication. It had been made known to Graham that Aston Villa would be interested if he was interested. And at a board meeting right after the end of the season, I think they played the final league game of that season a couple of days before, they had a board meeting at Vicarage Road, and Graham just said, look, an offer has been made, or an approach has been made by Aston Villa, and what he was really saying was he wanted the chairman and owner, Elton John, and the board of directors to say, no, you mustn't go, we want you here. But there was just a kind of a muted sort of feeling. And, Graham talked about that. Had he'd done 10 years, he'd become incredibly powerful at the club. He ran everything, he did everything. And maybe there were one or two people who thought, perhaps it's time for a change. And Graham kind of thought, perhaps it is time for a change. And again, it wasn't an easy change. It wasn't like he was going into a really top job. Aston Villa had just been relegated to the second division. And as you say, when he got there, he thought, blimey, this is a massive club with a huge ground that hosts the FA Cup semi-final pretty much every year. And yet the place is just, run down, really, falling to bits. There's no standards here. And he went through that club and he basically imposed his way on it very, very quickly and got them promoted. Only just, it was not easy, but he built a team that could get out of the second division. And then, of course, he worked his Graham Taylor magic, because they then finished second to Liverpool the very next... no, it wasn't the very next season, because they had a real brush with relegation, actually, in between. So he kept them up and then led them to second place in the first division behind Liverpool. And, but for maybe one or two signings towards the end of that season, 89-90, they might have run Liverpool even closer to that title. But no, he kind of was he was just a brilliant club manager, and I think proving it at 3 clubs in a row over what we're talking now, we're talking at least a 15-year period. He barely put a foot wrong in 15 years of club management. And I think when people say, well, why did Graham Taylor get the England job, I think that's got a lot to do with it.
Yeah, it's just such a shame when you see what he done as a club manager, that he just didn't get over the line and get his hands on that first division trophy, because that would have been a great picture. But yeah, it was whilst at Villa, Bobby Robson, he'd appointed him previously as like under 18, but now he'd sort of promoted him to B manager. So he was getting closer to that position of England's senior manager, and it was then, let's say, 1990, when Italia 90 had finished, that Bobby Robson moved on, and there was an England manager's position up for grabs, but it wasn't clear-cut initially, I think, because obviously there was Brian Clough was around and Howard Kendall of Everton.
Yeah, I mean, Graham, he sort of said that the race for the England manager's position was kind of happening in two lanes, really. There was a kind of the public lane and the private lane. I think it was known within the game a lot sooner that Bobby Robson was going to go. I think even the public knew by the time the World Cup was underway that Robson had said that this, I'm done with this. And of course, then they reached the semi-final. It was a really good, World Cup performance. That, I mean, it wasn't flashy and flamboyant by any stretch, but they got the results when they needed them. The last minute David Platt goal against Belgium in the second round, last minute of extra time, of course. But Bobby Robson had experienced just about the worst that the England manager's job could throw at a person. How he survived after Euro '88, really, I don't know. The press were absolutely out for him, weren't they? I wonder whether actually there were people, there weren't enough candidates who wanted to take it on, given the treatment that Bobby Robson had. But he experienced the best of what the England manager's job can be in 1990, or very nearly the best. I mean, they obviously didn't reach the final, but they came home as heroes, didn't they? And of course, Graham had seen this at close quarters because he was working as a journalist for, I think, the Times. I'm pretty sure it was the Times he was writing for, and he was writing a kind of a column every couple of days, not just about England, but about the other matches that he was at, and he was really soaking up what an international tournament is like from the media side of the fence. And I think it was at that, while that was all going on, the World Cup was going on, and whispers and rumours and people talk to people, I think he got the sense that he was very much in the frame for the job. And, Brian Clough, the press would have been, calling for somebody like Brian Clough simply because of his record as Nottingham Forest manager, which was incredible. But of course, we know Brian Clough had a difficult relationship with the FA. And whilst I'm not saying that Graham Taylor was a yes man and Brian Clough wasn't, Graham Taylor's face fitted much more than Brian Clough's. I think we've got to be clear about that. I think Howard Kendall as well, excellent club manager, won the league with Everton. But I think there were some question marks about him being the England manager that perhaps weren't necessarily football related. I think, when you look around at the other candidates, I know Joe Royle was another one. Again, he would have been, at that time, would have been more of a surprise, I think, than Graham Taylor. Graham Taylor had just had the best managerial season of any English manager. The league was won by Liverpool, whose manager was, correct me if I'm wrong, it was Kenny Dalglish.
I believe it would have been, yes. Yeah.
So, perhaps not as controversial, not as much of a surprise as people perhaps look back at and think, well, I think it was a fairly logical appointment. The other one, Terry Venables, I think probably would have taken it. But again, he wasn't, it took a lot of pressure to get Venables on the shortlist in 94 when he eventually did take over after Graham had gone. So, the FA is a funny organisation. Certainly it was back then, wasn't it? They don't necessarily make the choice based just upon the results, just upon the managerial reputation. I think there is an element of kind of diplomacy, representing the country, representing the FA. At home and abroad, and like I say, Graham Taylor was as straight and upstanding as they come, and he made no secret of the fact that if he was offered the job, he would take it, come what may.
Yeah, he was 45 when he was appointed, and it was one of his proudest moments. Although when he got there and got to wherever the FA headquarters would have been at the time, realised very quickly that there was no daily training, no sort of communication with the players on a regular basis. Games were obviously every other month, every 2 months. So it was a totally different learning experience for him.
Yeah, I mean, he would have known that, but I think it still surprised him. It was Lancaster Gate was where the FA was based at the time, and he had an office there, of course, as England manager, and he had a secretary, and he went there for work, and he commuted down, and he sometimes stayed down, but he didn't have that day-to-day involvement as a club manager, a workaholic club manager. Let's face it, who was over every detail of everything, as I've said. And the England job just didn't work like that. And so he tried to make it similar. He made appointments to go and see every First Division club and a good deal of clubs in the Second Division, and Glasgow Rangers up in Scotland as well, because they had a few English players at the time. And Marseille to go and see Chris Waddle, and Italy to go and see David Platt once he got there, and he wanted to build relationships with all the players, and he actually wrote to the clubs and said, look, I'd like to come and observe training. I'll take a session or two if you want. He was trying to keep his hands dirty, I guess is the phrase, isn't it? He's trying to keep his sleeves rolled up and keep the tracksuit on and keep working with players, because international football then, let's remember, was different to how it is now. There wasn't the international break. Most international friendlies or qualifier matches were just on a Wednesday night in between two full league programs. So the managers, the squad, didn't get together for an extended period. They'd sometimes get together. Graham would try to get the squad together as soon as possible on the sort of Saturday night or Sunday after the league matches, and then he'd have them till really Wednesday night. They'd start going home again, back to their clubs, to be back training on Thursday for the weekend's fixtures. So he found the rhythm of that really a total change to what he was used to, and he made no bones about it. He didn't really enjoy it. He didn't enjoy the fact that there wasn't as much football-related work to do. There was a lot of kind of talking about things and planning the future and looking at, when we're going to Turkey, we're playing in Izmir or wherever, which hotel are we going to go to, this one or this one, and making decisions as a club manager. He would just, really would have been just kind of something to decide, move on and get back to the training pitch, or get back to looking for players to, going and watching opposition or whatever. All of that was stripped right back, and the rhythm of the working week and the working month was a lot emptier, I think. And so that magnified, I guess, the pressure on each individual match, and it certainly reduced the time that he got to work with a group of players and try to embed some of his ideas. There's so many differences about international management that, until speaking to Graham at length about this, I hadn't really appreciated. But putting together all of the best players in the country, particularly back then when there was a bit more kind of tactical diversity amongst the First Division teams. I mean, these days, a lot of the players that play for the top clubs, they all kind of play the same way, don't they, really?
Yes.
The game is a lot more sort of homogenous, really, now. And, of course, you can watch so much more of it. So everyone's kind of aware of how the game is being played. But back then, he'd have, I don't know, two players from Arsenal and two, one from Nottingham Forest and one from, I don't know, Leeds to make a back four out of, and they're all used to doing something different. Even down to kind of the cliche thing of the Arsenal players want to push up and play offside and the other two don't. Trying to make the team play the way he wanted to play. I think a lot of the sort of the control he had at club level, where his way was there was one way and you either followed the line or you didn't because you were out the team. It wasn't possible to do that at international level, because not that players were undroppable, but it is a lot harder to say, right, two or three of the best players aren't going to be in the lineup because they're just not going to play my way. So he's always kind of wrestling those things, trying to create a team that fitted his identity from what was clearly a much more talented group than he'd been used to working with before, but all players that had their own ideas, their own ways of doing things.
Yeah. Well, he got his first game under his belt, which was a friendly 1-0 win over Hungary, which was then followed by a 2-0 European Championships qualifying win over Poland, which, of course, Euro 92, that was the next aim for the England team. They eventually made it to to Sweden and Euro 92, but everything then just seemed to conspire to go against him with injuries and various events. John Barnes, who he'd known way back from his Watford time, Mark Wright, Lee Dixon, Rob Jones, all these players that he'd had throughout the qualifying campaign were all of a sudden injured.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the first year of Graham's time as England manager, he was unbeaten in that first year. The first defeat came at the start of the second season. They lost at home to Germany in a friendly 1-0. But yeah, when he got to the finals of the Euros, again, it was a small tournament, wasn't it? Only 8 teams qualified.
That's right.
So you basically had to. Well, you always have to finish top 2 in the group to advance to the semi-finals or to the next round. Sorry, but I think the 8-team format, it did mean that there wasn't a kind of weak side in the tournament. I suppose the weakest side in the tournament was Denmark, who on paper, who hadn't actually qualified, had they? They were famously called up off the beach, and they replaced Yugoslavia, who of course were unable to take part in the tournament. And then when they didn't beat Denmark, it was a 0-0 draw. Suddenly the pressure's on against France. Okay, not the France of 98, but still a good side. Another 0-0 draw. I think Stuart Pearce hit the bar in that game, but not a lot to really write home about. And then it all hinged on that game against Sweden. From a really good position, they kind of collapsed, and it was that was the kind of the beginning of the really difficult relationship that Graham had with particularly the tabloid newspapers. It was Swedes 2, Turnips 1, wasn't it?
Yeah.
The headline on the Sun. With our memories kind of deceive us. The Turnip picture wasn't until the next day, or a couple of days later. But the Sun had really gone and run with this, and it did capture the public's imagination, didn't it? But I have to say, yes, he was very, very unlucky with injuries. He had Gary Lineker, who was obviously going to retire at the end of the tournament, but he was not the Lineker of even 2 years before. Lineker had missed that penalty against Brazil in the friendly a couple of weeks before the tournament started, trying to do the Panenka. He had the chance at the time to equal and overtake Bobby Charlton's goal-scoring record, and kind of blew it with that. Of course, the controversial moment was substituting Lineker, who was the captain, of course, in that game against Sweden. And not just the decision to substitute him, which you could justify on the basis of the performance that Lineker had put in that night against Sweden, but bringing on Alan Smith, it all fed into this narrative that Graham Taylor, when put under pressure and everything was going against him, he was a long ball merchant and he just wanted to thump it long. And I have to say, just for context really, and just to remind myself, I watched as much footage of those 3 games as I could find and frankly could stomach on YouTube. And I mean, it is dreadful stuff. It is dreadful stuff, even by kind of 90 standards, and not to malign Scandinavian pitches in summer, but they weren't the best surfaces. As we saw, I mean, Barnes was injured playing in a friendly in, I think, Helsinki, wasn't it, on a pitch that really a squad going to a Euros shouldn't have had to be playing on, so close to the tournament. I mean, asking for trouble. Yeah. But the actual football, I mean, there's just nobody able to put a foot on the ball, and it's just like a sort of mad game of pinball. And of course, it's easy when you look at the way the lineup changed through that tournament. It looks like Graham Taylor is struggling for an idea. He's got a squad with several problems. He's having to find compromise options, but he's trying to find a different compromise option each time, and none of them look all that appealing. I mean, Keith Curle having to play out of position at fullback in the first game, and I think he got booked really early, which meant he was just he had an awful time after that. They tried to go to a sort of 3 at the back, and that didn't really work. And I think in the second game, he sort of put Carlton Palmer in a sort of defensive position. But no offence to Carlton Palmer, he's not Franz Beckenbauer as a player, was he? No. And so, yes, there were a lot of mitigating factors, but the team didn't play well. And frankly, once Sweden got at them, they really folded, didn't they? I mean, it was it was 2-1, obviously, but that team playing that way was not going to do anything in the semi-final. And I think that's probably where the kind of hostility from the press came from, because the evidence of your eyes was that this was not the England team of just 2 years ago. We all remembered, the heroic failure of Turin. Well, this was just failure, really.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you mentioned there the media where this was where it all maybe began, but it wasn't just on him, which is what as soon as I began reading this, I thought this is horrendous. Obviously, the Sun had run the headline, but there were journalists whilst he was in Sweden with the team doing his job. Back home, there were journalists not breaking into his house, but finding their way into his house to basically doorstep his wife, and I think it was and his mother as well. And that was, I think, where he really thought this is sort of over the line.
To be fair, I think that was the following summer when I mean it got pretty disastrous, didn't it? Because the World Cup qualifying campaign for USA '94, I mean, it was going okay, wasn't it? It was going okay. I mean, they got stunned in the first game against Norway. They were leading, and then Rekdal hit one from out of the blue, and they dropped the point there. Then I think they were 2-0 up against the Netherlands and ended up 2-2. And they went to Norway for the away game just before this tour to the USA, which was, supposed to be kind of like the pre-World Cup recce, go and experience the stadiums, go and, check out where they'd be training, check out the hotels and all this. But they had to go and play, obviously, Norway in a crucial qualifier, June 93. And, I mean, they lost 2-0. And again, Graham was criticised for lots of things in his career, dropping Paul Gascoigne for the game in Dublin in the previous campaign, for example. He was criticised for playing Lee Sharp at wing back, or left back rather. And Graham would have always said, look, I was going for a sort of solid 3-man defence with, Pallister, Walker and Adams, and then 2 fullbacks, wing backs, Dixon and Sharp. I wasn't playing Lee Sharp, one of the best wingers in England, as a defender. I was playing him as a wing back. But, the subtleties of that were lost because the result was, the performance was poor and the result was dreadful. They lost 2-0, and suddenly World Cup qualification was, really in the balance. And straight off the back of that, they went to the US and lost 2-0 to the United States, who, they ended up having a decent World Cup, as hosts, as far as it goes. Not a terrible team by any stretch, but no great shakes. And that was when, it wasn't the football reporters that Graham really ever had the trouble with. He could handle the team being dismantled by a football journalist, or his tactics being dismantled, or, the criticism from football journalists who were watching the matches. It was more the kind of the news type journalists who were, and often a lot of them were freelancers as well, going to, saying that they work for the Sun or whatever, but, really freelancers. I imagine many of them just trying to flog a story. But like you say, Graham's wife in the supermarket thinking, well, I can't, knowing she's being followed around by somebody who's trying to take pictures, thinking, well, I can't go anywhere near the root vegetables because they'll have a field day. If I pick up a swede or a turnip or whatever, or anything, just a sense that they were being hemmed in. And I think the thing that came across was that back then, early 90s, the Premier League had only just started. The money was beginning to kind of increase in football, but it hadn't, the football hadn't pulled the lever on the jackpot just yet. And football managers and football players, they still lived relatively normal lives. They lived in normal places. They didn't live in kind of detached, gated communities with, we see now, don't we?
Yeah.
Players have trouble. They're targeted by criminals and what have you. I mean, that's a completely different issue, of course, but Graham Taylor lived in his community, and so people knew who Rita Taylor was, and so it was hard for her to have people shouting stuff in the street. Your husband's a disgrace. And this sort of thing happened. I won't say, super regularly, but it happened enough to be unpleasant.
Of course.
And where Graham drew the line when, his elderly parents were at home, off the generation where you could leave your back door unlocked and everything would be fine. And a sort of film crew had walked in and were trying to sort of ask questions about, what do you think about, your son's latest defeat? And he took that hard because his great phrase was, family first, except on match day. Graham's family meant the absolute world to him. And he just felt that, it was unreasonable that his job as England manager would place them in the firing line. He said, you can say what you like about me, I can take it. And even that wasn't quite true, because some of the stuff that was said about him was dreadful. But the stuff that his wife had to put up with was, just no one can say that's reasonable. And I think, the journalists who covered the games, they did so in good faith, even if they were very critical. But, the person that came up with the computer-generated turnip picture, probably thought they were being incredibly funny and witty and what have you. And, yeah, fine, okay, it's a joke. But it became kind of beyond the joke, I think, for Graham, because the public, a small number, did sort of latch onto that and use it against him.
Yeah. And then, unfortunately, next to come was the Netherlands away game for qualifying for USA 94. There was the game on one hand, and then there was the Channel 4 documentary on the other, which I kind of think, had the Channel 4 documentary not have been there, not have happened, we may not think about that Netherlands game in the manner that we do. It was just such an unfortunate, well, they say sort of a perfect storm, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, by that stage, they had to go to the Netherlands, and that team, the Dutch team, were flipping good, weren't they? I mean,
yeah.
It was Koeman, Overmars, Bergkamp, Rijkaard. It was a world-class team at home in the stadium at Rotterdam, which is a real cauldron of a place. And even in that, there was a sense of injustice, wasn't there? Because Koeman hauled down
David Platt, wasn't it?
David Platt on the edge of the box. I think any suggestion that it should have been a penalty, I think that's pushing it a bit. But Koeman certainly should have been off the pitch for that. And then, of course, not long after that, he was at the other end, having not been sent off, standing over a free kick, which he's going to flick one, and he did. He did. Koeman put it in the top corner, and then Bergkamp's second goal. I mean, a terrific team goal, and the Dutch were much better than England that night. But you could see, the frustration for Graham Taylor on the touchline, because he was mic'd up, and what he was saying to the fourth official was broadcast in that documentary. And like you say, would we remember that game without that footage? Probably not, would we? We would just think, oh well, they went difficult away game, they lost it. But actually, those moments are kind of iconic, aren't they? And I mean, talking to Graham about why he did the film, he did it because he wanted to show people what the England manager's job was all about. He wanted to show the pressure. He wanted to show what a press conference entailed. Again, we've got to kind of detach ourselves from the current day and recognise that back then there wasn't the wall-to-wall Sky Sports News coverage of football, was there?
No.
So you didn't see what a press conference was, or hear how the questions were. And when you look at those press conferences, they are more combative, and the questions are a bit more hostile, and there's certainly a lot more, energy in the room than the kind of soporific kind of stuff we get today. Where sometimes the managers say the odd thing, but generally there's a sort of quite a distance between the journalists and the managers who are speaking. I mean, a sort of not just a physical distance. I mean, there's a kind of there's a sort of an unwritten kind of code, a power balance, isn't there? Whereas back then, the power balance was all with the Fleet Street press, who felt like they were entitled to ask whatever they wanted in however way they wanted to ask it. And Graham was given the opportunity to kind of shelve that documentary and, once it had been made, and say, look, no, I don't want it to go out. But he stuck by his initial decision, which was to, give them permission. He didn't make many cuts. I think he regretted not getting some of the language toned down, because, he made the point that, the swearing was kind of football's industrial language. Yeah. But the man in the street, the woman in the street, and he said that certainly the people at the church that he attended were like, your language was not. He felt embarrassed by that, and I don't think he needed to, given what we kind of know about football is not an environment where people are necessarily standing on ceremony, are they? The niceties do go out the window a bit, but people hadn't been exposed to that. They didn't know. So he bore the brunt of kind of opening the windows and letting people see what it was like. But I think, when you compare that documentary to the ones that are so kind of popular and so talked about now, I mean, now they feel so sterilised and sterile, don't they? Sort of everything's kind of watered down and filtered and edited in such a way that even the things that make people look, slightly, controversial or bad, they feel like they've just been we're looking off from the side. Whereas I think that was a real raw documentary that took us to the heart of a man striving to achieve something that he would have been the pinnacle of his career, leading his country to a World Cup, and the disappointment, the crushing disappointment of not managing to do that.
Yeah, no, it's a real insight into how football was then. It's such an interesting documentary if people haven't seen it. But obviously from that, qualification to the World Cup in 1994 was gone, and there was only really sort of resignation left on the table, and the FA took them up on it.
Yeah, I mean, they went to San Marino. Again, that was an odd one, wasn't it? Because I think it would have been the first tournament that San Marino, or one of the very first tournaments that those real tiny principalities were involved in the qualifiers. And San Marino being played in Bologna, I think it was, and England go 1-0 down straight from the kickoff. and the thing that, we see Graham's reaction in the film, the documentary, it's called An Impossible Job. And I think you can probably find it on YouTube still these days. Yeah. The big phrase, do I not like that? But the one thing Graham said about that match against San Marino was that he sat on the bench. Stuart Pearce, I think, makes the mistake with the back pass straight from the kickoff, and the San Marino striker, who was, a sort of an Italian 4th or 5th division level player, breaks through and puts it in the net. And Graham just said, at that moment, I just thought, I looked to the sky and I said, I'm not God. I am not a bad man. What have I done to deserve this? And I think they won 7-1, but it was a futile result because they couldn't qualify, and he had no choice. He had to offer his resignation, and he would never have been able to have carried on. But it meant that England didn't go to the 1994 World Cup, and I don't remember 74 or 78, but I know the significance of missing a World Cup was every bit as kind of monumental then. But it's for some reason in 94, English football was kind of picking itself up out of the doldrums of the hooliganism of the 80s. The pride had been restored to a degree, and to miss out on the World Cup, I mean, it was a real sting for the country's sort of footballing pride, wasn't it?
Yeah, and he tortured himself. He watched the whole tournament, by all accounts, during that summer. I guess it's his job, or it's within his job remit and that, but just kind of think, don't do that to yourself.
Yeah, I mean, his kind of his instinct, I suppose, was take himself off to I don't know, the Caribbean or somewhere, because he said the one thing with the World Cup is where do you go to avoid it?
Yes.
That's everybody does watch the World Cup, and he thought, well, even if I go to the Caribbean, it'll be on. People will know who I am. British holidaymakers, English holidaymakers will be in places. I don't want to be out on my holidays, looking like I haven't got a care in the world, where this is actually the thing that's hurt me the most in my professional life. So he did sort of want to, he did put himself through it. He says he watched. I mean, he told me this story at his house. We were stood in the garden, and he said, I think he was living at a different house, but the image is still strong in my mind. But he said, I just go out in the garden between the matches, and I just sort of roll a football around with the sole of my foot, and tap it against the wall or tap it against the fence, and just alone with my thoughts, and then puff myself up and go in and watch the next game, whatever that was. And like you say, tortured himself really, because every time he saw Norway, he thought, well, that should be us. Or every time he saw the Netherlands, he thought, well, that should be us. And what I mean, for somebody whose entire kind of professional ambition and identity was built around the fact, first of all, that he was the England manager, the fact that he was unable to be successful as England manager did hurt him significantly.
And that kind of, he felt, was held against him for a little while, in the fact that it took him a little while to get another job. But another one came along, and he went to Wolves, lasted a season and a half there, but never really felt at home until he did go home, as it were, when he went back to Watford, and just as he'd done before, took him up to the top flight again, which now was the Premier League.
Extraordinary, really, isn't it? And like you say, the England job did it did follow him around for a while. I mean, I think it's in the book, but if it isn't, it's certainly on the record that the turnip nickname stuck with him. The Sun certainly didn't let it go, and that he and his agent Ian Wilson had to go into the offices at the Sun and say, look, this is causing me professional harm. You need to drop this, or we're going to take action. He ended up writing a column, of course, for the Sun, and his rationale for that was like, well, if they're going to talk like that about me, I might as well take their money. He was not without a sense of humour about things to a point. When he was the Wolves manager, he, of course, had Jack Hayward's money to spend. There was an awful lot of pressure. The club had been out of the top flight for coming up to 12 years, I think. They'd been down as low as the 4th division as well, and they were kind of the sleeping giants of what is now the Championship. And he did build a good team there. He spent a lot of money, but they missed out in the playoffs. And then the following season, he said, there may be one or two players that he didn't refresh quickly enough, and they didn't get off to a good start. And he was, sacked officially for the only time in his career, I think.
Right.
I think so. So then he really was out of the game, thinking, well, where next? Because it hasn't worked at Wolves. Who's going to come along? It wasn't even as if Wolves were a Premier League club, So Watford was, to a degree, a sort of saviour for him. They were struggling at the bottom end of that same division when they sacked Glenn Roeder towards, I think it's February 96. Graham went in initially as kind of a firefighter to try and keep them up. They didn't actually stay up, although they had a very good go at it, scored a lot of goals. It was like the good times had come back again. Now I think there was a 6-3 and a 4-2 and a couple of 4-4s. It was a real kind of old Graham Taylor style. Well, look, if we're going to go down, we're at least going to have a go. It was sort of 4 forwards and all hands on deck to try and get themselves out of trouble. They went down on the final day when they lost to Leicester, and then the club was in a bit of a mess. It needed a lot of things sort of regenerating and refreshing that had been let slip since he'd not been there the first time round. So in the 10 years, 10 years of decline really to arrest. But he stepped upstairs initially as a kind of general manager to kind of look after all of that stuff. And then when Elton John then came back, Graham Taylor got back in the dugout and they won the second division title. They then won the first division playoff final against Bolton Wanderers to get back into the Premier League. And although they didn't stay up in the Premier League, you know, it was incredible, really, because I think most Watford supporters, myself included, thought, well, you know, the Premier League ship has completely sailed, and you know, we haven't got a ticket. But Graham Taylor re-established the club as a kind of once again, you know, anything above sort of halfway up the Championship is considered the good times, I think, for Watford supporters.
It was then, though, that I think sort of he realised that the Premier League had changed the game that he sort of grew up with, and being at Lincoln and Watford and Villa, and then decided, right, I think it is time I retire from this, and he retired, and then we'd hear him on the likes of 5 Live, where I very much remember listening to him.
Well, yeah, he initially retired as Watford manager, and then sort of 15 months later was tempted out of retirement by Aston Villa, and I think he thought he could work his magic there again. He had a full season with Villa, and you know, they were kind of hovering above the relegation zone in the Premier League, and I think there he realised the agents have too much say. The manager no longer runs the club from top to bottom. You know, he was older as well, and perhaps you know, his methods didn't resonate quite so readily with young players who perhaps weren't prepared to sort of fall into line and do it Graham Taylor's way, or you know, or it's the highway. He certainly couldn't insist that players lived within a certain radius of the ground, which is what he'd done all the way through his club career to try and build that sense of everybody being, you know, on the doorstep. And I mean, he told a story about having signed Peter Crouch from, I think he must have been Queen's Park Rangers, maybe certainly somewhere down south anyway. Okay. And you know, it's sort of the problem of Peter Crouch, a very tall man, squeezing himself into some kind of sports car to drive a couple of hours into training every day and a couple of hours back again, and just thinking, this is not, you know, I'm not having a go at Peter Crouch here in any sense, but you know, just the sense, foreign players who would come over and rent a place, you know, not really giving the sense that they were here for the, you know, for the you know, long haul. I think Graham found a lot of those aspects about the Premier League, not least as well the sums of money. I think he found that a lot more difficult to deal with. Maybe he couldn't manage the way he wanted to manage, and he again tells a bit of a story about you know, sitting in the dugout at Villa Park towards the end of that season, and somebody shouting, you know, your day's gone, Taylor, you know, and he said, every club I've been at, even when they're dishing it out, they've always called me Graham. But getting called Taylor, I'm not sure. This sort of says something to me. And yeah, so he did retire for the final time. And like you say, I thought he was an excellent summariser on 5 Live. You know, he really understood how to convey a game that people aren't watching, you know, and talk about it in a way that made sense, and pick up little things. And sometimes I'd listen to a commentary game if I was driving to a match that I was watching. You know, if he was doing the lunchtime game, I'd listen to the commentary, and then I'd watch the highlights on Match of the Day later and go, oh yeah, you know, Graham Taylor talked about that pass or that bit of movement or whatever. He's just easy manner talking about football, you know, lasted until the very end. I mean, I saw him for the final time about probably 2-3 weeks before he died, just before Christmas 2016, and then he died in the January 2017. But every time I met him to talk about something for the book, we would spend the first half an hour talking about the weekend's game, or you know, how Watford were doing, or what, you know, what the kind of the controversy of the day was in the Premier League. You know, his passion for the game never left him, and his ability to sort of talk about it in an interesting and surprising way. You know, you talk about Graham Taylor's voice, just to go back to the beginning, and I thought I knew it so well, and yet he would always say something that kind of would surprise me, or make me think about something in a different way. And he had a few little, I won't say they're chips on his shoulder at all, but he always liked to point out that when people talked about Steven Gerrard as a midfield player, you'd say, well, we had a holding midfield player like that at Watford or at Villa. They didn't call them holding midfield players then that held and then bombed on, or whatever. But we had one, Or he'd always bring up the fact that when they talk about wing backs being, when they were in fashion, probably still are in fashion to a degree. He said, well, we were doing that as well, and the idea that he was this sort of long ball merchant that played one way for 25 years, I think is a bit of a fallacy. He did do things that were innovative in the game. It's just that to the greater, wider football public, the results as England manager, well, as we all know, the results are what you get judged by.
Unfortunately, yes. The book, Graham Taylor, in his own words, I say it's been out now for about 5 years now, but if Watford fans and Lincoln fans and Villa fans will have their great memories of Graham Taylor, and as I say, unfortunately, England fans, maybe their memories are tarnished by various events, but I suggest give this book a read, and it really does sort of change your perspective on how you may view Graham Taylor. And from a personal level, I only met him once and had a 5-minute chat with him, and I think probably even back then, when was that, 2012 during the Euros there, I thought, the impression maybe I had as a younger teenager when all this was going on, my view totally changed just by meeting him.
Yeah, I think a lot of people who had any dealings with Graham would say he was a very decent person. He did create a bond with supporters. He would reply to people's letters, and he'd sometimes call people up if they'd written a critical letter, and he'd say, well, look, okay, let's talk about it. He always tried to look after his players and their families. But he was quite a ruthless football man as well. The team came first, and there was no such thing as kind of as a friendship that would be exempt from a player being left out of a team or a coach being replaced or whatever. He was somebody who put the needs of the team before everything, and but he did so, I think, in a fair way. And I think we witnessed this when he did pass away. The number of people who had a story about Graham Taylor just being a decent human being, for them in perhaps a time of difficulty, or just helping them away from football. A player who's one that springs to mind is a young Watford player called Gifton Noel-Williams, who was I think 16, and his girlfriend was pregnant, and he was called into the manager's office, Graham Taylor's office, and Gifton was, his knees were knocking, thinking, oh, what's going to happen here? Am I going to get in trouble? And Graham said, look, you're only on an apprentice salary. It's going to be tough, isn't it? You haven't really got the money to do everything you need to do. And Graham, out of his own pocket, lent Gifton some money and said, there you go. That's what you get everything you need for the baby. There you go. And Gifton Noel-Williams never forgot that, and I think it's things like that are somebody's legacy, perhaps more than conceding a first-minute goal away at San Marino.
Yeah. No, I think that's a nice way to round off. I've really enjoyed that, Lionel. Thank you very much for your time that you've given us there. I mean, just for your own personal side, what are you working on anything at this moment in time?
Well, I'm not a football journalist, really. I'm a cycling journalist, and I run the cycling podcast. Yeah, so that kind of takes a lot of my time, but so I kind of quite enjoy now just being a football supporter and watching my own team and my non-league teams. But I've never really covered the game. I've written a lot about Watford, my club, and I've written the odd football book unrelated to Watford. And, the opportunity to do Graham's autobiography really was the result of, I guess, a bit of luck, a bit of happenstance and a bit of circumstance. And I'm very, very grateful that I got that opportunity.
Many thanks go to Lionel Birnie there. Graham's autobiography is called In His Own Words. It's published through Peloton Publishing. It's available wherever you buy your books from. Or your local library, I guess, too. You can follow Lionel on Twitter at Lionel Birnie, LionelBirnie. And if cycling is your thing, he mentioned the cycling podcast there at the end. You can find that at cycling_podcast. Thank you very much, as always, for listening. And as I said at the beginning, the show is on all the socials. Go give it a find, a like, a follow. Feel free to say hello. I'll be back with you very soon with some more England content. So until then, take care. Cheers.